smart tax reform and the Republican tax plan and how it impacts the mortgage interest deduction. So I'm Diane Yentel. I'm president and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We are a membership organization dedicated to achieving socially just public policy that ensures that the lowest income people have decent, safe solutions that they need. So we have a terrific panel today that I'm really proud to welcome and to sit with today. Our panelists to my immediate right are Nela Richardson, who is the chief economist from Redfin Corporation. To her right is Tatjana Meschede. She's the associate director of the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University. To her right is Mechele Dickerson. She's the Arthur L. Moller Chair in Bankruptcy Law and Practice and University Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And to her right is Dr. Sandel, a practicing pediatrician and the principal investigator with Children's Health Watch out of Boston. So we can advance the slide, please. So to start, before we talk about some of the solutions in tax reform, I want to talk a little bit about the problem that we're seeking to solve. And that is a lack of affordable homes affordable to the lowest income people. So this map shows from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's research, the gap, where we quantify the shortage of homes affordable and available to the lowest income people. And this year we find that there is a shortage of 7.4 million homes affordable and available for those lowest income people. These are seniors, people with disabilities, families with kids working low-wage jobs. Another way of looking at this or thinking about this is for every 100 extremely low-income renters, there are just 35 homes that are affordable and available to them nationally. And you can see that it ranges throughout the country from a low of just 15 homes in Nevada for every 100 extremely low-income households to a high in Alabama, where there's just 61 homes affordable and available for the lowest income people. So the shortage is severe. It impacts every community across the country, rural, urban, suburban. And you can advance, please. So part of the issue here is not that we lack, certainly we don't lack data about who are the lowest income renters, what are their needs. We don't lack solutions, proven solutions to end homelessness or housing poverty through programs like the National Housing Trust Fund, which is one of the newest federal resources dedicated specifically to fill this gap, to create rental homes affordable for the lowest income people. And it turns out we don't lack the resources, right? So nationally, with this chart, one way to look at this chart is to recognize that as a country, we spend about $200 billion a year to help Americans buy and rent their homes. And the bulk of those resources, a full 3/4 of it, goes to subsidize higher income homeowners through the mortgage interest deduction and other tax benefits of homeownership. And these are households who would be stably housed without the government's help. So there's just 1/4 of those resources left to assist the lowest income renters, those with the clearest and the greatest needs. And in fact, every year we spend more to subsidize 7 million of the highest income homeowners than we do to assist 55 million of the lowest income renters combined. And in fact, 15% of the benefit of the mortgage interest deduction goes to the top 1% of earners in this country, which means that every year as taxpayers, we're spending $10.5 billion to subsidize the homes of some of the wealthiest people in the world. Next slide, please. So the problem clearly is we have a severe housing shortage for the lowest income people. We have over 3/4 of the lowest income renters that are severely cost burdened. They're paying more than half of their income towards their rent each month. And there's hundreds of thousands more households who have no homes at all. We have a housing system that is a lottery system for the lowest income renters, where just 1 in every 4 households, low income renters in need, get any assistance at all. and we have less than 25% of federal housing resources going to the lowest income renters. Next slide, please. So the United for Homes campaign proposes a number of solutions to these problems, and it is essentially to enact smart reforms to the mortgage interest deduction and to reinvest the savings into affordable rental housing solutions for the lowest income people, like the National Housing Trust Fund program. So the first part of the solution is to lower the cap on the size of a mortgage on which you can deduct your interest from $1 million down to $500,000. The second change would be to shift from a deduction as it is today into a non-refundable capped credit worth a percentage of annual interest. Altogether, these changes would save $241 billion over 10 years to be reinvested in affordable rental housing solutions. Next slide, please. So the first one that I talked about, lowering the cap from $1 million down to $500,000, this impacts fewer than 6% of mortgage holders across the country, and it saves $87 billion over 10 years. And you can see that certainly in New York and California, there are more households that would be impacted, but there are wide swaths of the country where it's fewer than 2%, less than 1% of mortgage holders that would be impacted at all, and we would save $87 billion over 10 years. Next slide, please. The other change, shifting from a deduction to a non-refundable cash credit. This is an example, this one and the next slide, please, Elaine, shows some examples of what tax returns would look like for low and middle income and higher income households if we were to make this change. And this change saves a lot of additional money as well, and it provides a new tax break for 10 million low-income homeowners who currently don't get any tax break from having a mortgage because they don't earn enough to itemize their tax deductions. It would also give a deeper tax break to another 15 million low-income homeowners. So altogether, these two changes would mean 25 million low and middle-income homeowners would get a tax break, and we would save $241 billion over 10 years to reinvest in affordable rental housing solutions. Next slide. So very briefly, the Big Six tax plan that came out, it's now a couple weeks ago, just to talk about the changes that it would make for the mortgage interest deduction, and we'll talk about this more throughout the panel and in Q&A. But the thing you should know is that the Big Six Republican tax plan does reform the mortgage interest deduction. It doesn't do it directly through the kind of changes that we're talking about, but indirectly by doubling the standard deduction. And in doing that, it decreases the number of people who will need to itemize their taxes, and so it significantly lowers the number of households who will benefit from the mortgage interest deduction, down to about 5% of mortgage holders who would now benefit from the mortgage interest deduction. And in making the change in that way, without further reforming the mortgage interest deduction, it makes the mortgage interest deduction even more regressive than it is today, which is hard to do. So it would mean that what's left of the mortgage interest deduction would be to benefit the highest income households with the largest mortgages. So we're going to turn now to our panel. Before we do, I want to briefly say thank you to Representative Keith Ellison and to Senator Merkley, both of whom are champions, longtime champions for affordable housing and for rebalancing federal housing policy, and who are joining us in hosting this briefing today. So thank you to those two tremendous champions and leaders. And I'll turn now to Nela Richardson from the Redfin Corporation to talk.
I'd also like to add my thanks for the convening of this important topic. I am Nela Richardson. I'm Chief Economist at Redfin. I represent an industry that is generally not at a table like this, in a room like this. I am in real estate. Redfin makes its money by helping people buy and sell homes. We are a real estate brokerage, which, put in other words, means that Redfin makes its money helping people who benefit from the mortgage interest deduction. So your question should be, why are you in this room? And I will give you an answer. We can go to the next slide, which basically is just a summary of what Diane has said. That the mortgage interest deduction helps high-income people who itemize. People who make over $100,000 receive the bulk of the benefit, and people making $200,000 or more, they receive a third of the benefit. Redfin is in this market that we call housing every single day. Thousands of agents doing 10,000s of tours a week, trying to help people fulfill their dreams of homeownership. And so I'm not here because I hate homeowners or hate homeownership. In fact, I believe that the home is the way that the middle class builds wealth. The problem is the mortgage interest deduction isn't helping the middle class. It's broken when it comes to middle class families, and it needs to be fixed. It needs to be renovated. So I'm going to show you a few slides on why. We are in a market that we've never seen before. The inventory shortage that Diane talked about in the rental market, it's the same in the housing for sale market. We have not seen any increase in inventory in 24 consecutive months. The shortage is extreme. Only people who can pay in cash, move quickly, use technology, get apps, buy houses in our largest cities. And guess what? The largest cities are where the jobs are. So we have the cycle of being priced out of the very places of opportunity that the middle class need to grow their wealth. Not only is this picture bad in terms of inventory, it's actually worse than it looks. Because we haven't seen any increase in the starter home segment of the for sale market since the bottom of the housing market in 2011. We have seen no increase in inventory for homes priced under $260,000 nationally. So for a middle class family trying to buy a house in a major city, they are virtually priced out. Next slide. Yet home prices are growing. Inventory is not growing. Those of you who took econ, house prices will grow if there's high demand, and we've had record low mortgage rates. There's high demand. That means high-income people are taking advantage of rock-bottom rates, while middle-class families are sidelined when rates are low. We know that rates are set to rise, and yet middle-class families have skipped this record low level of mortgage rates because home prices have grown so much. Right now, home prices are up 8% over last year. 8%. And they've been rising all of this time, every single month, and still they continue to rise. Also, this is a fast market. Companies like Redfin have made the market more efficient. Apps have made the buyer more savvy. We know that a quarter of the market has a contract on a new home in under 2 weeks. That means if you need a mortgage that takes 30 days to ratify, qualify, and get an appraisal, you're already out of time for this market. It's a market that moves quickly. Next slide. So what does that mean for housing affordability? Well, it's eroding for the middle class. That engine of wealth creation is broken. It needs to be tinkered, it needs to be fixed, and it needs help. And what we're seeing is rather dramatic. We did some research on the 30 largest metro areas in the country, and we found a significant drop in those making the middle income for those cities who can afford what was for sale in those markets. In 2012, families making the median income for households in those metros could afford 44% of the homes for sale. By 2016, that number had dropped to 32%. And this is not just a West Coast problem, this is a widespread national problem. This chart maps the most affordable cities from least affordable, San Diego, Denver, West Coast cities for middle income families, to most affordable, which would be Minneapolis, Minnesota. But the problem is no metro gets a pass. Even in our most affordable metro, Minneapolis, the inequality by race on what people can afford is dramatic. In Minneapolis, Those making the median income for white households can afford 61% of the inventory. That's great. But if you're making the African American family income, you can only afford 5% of what's available in Minneapolis. No city gets a pass. These numbers are dramatic. And when it comes to race, we have a significant issue in terms of affordability for Black and Hispanic middle income families. In fact, in West Coast markets, African Americans and Hispanics making the middle income are virtually priced out. They can afford 5% of the listings available in these markets on average. And these are hot markets. There's no inventory in this lower percentage of homes for sale, and it's a very fertile ground for investors looking to flip them or turn them into rentals. So even where there is affordable inventory, there's a lot of competitive demand from speculative buyers in these markets. So to conclude, the lack of affordability is permeating both our rental and housing markets. The mortgage interest rate deduction does not address the real need in the housing market, which is the middle-class home buyer, not the upper and middle-class home buyer, and certainly not the top 1% of the market. Thank you. With that, I'll conclude.
This is on. Good morning. I also want to thank the National Income Housing Coalition for inviting me to be here and for agreeing to partner in this new research brief that we actually released today. There are copies outside, I believe. And of course, we also have links on our respective websites. So what I will do is actually I'm going to add a few more statistics to the problem to be solved. So I will provide a little bit of a summary of the data that are included in this report. But before I start, I would like to thank, two of my colleagues, Dr. Laura Sullivan and Fernanda Escobar, who actually did all the work on this report. They couldn't be here, so I'm here, but they really need to be thanked for doing all the important work. So at ISP, we are a research institute at Meller School of Brandeis. Our goal is to produce research evidence of racial disparities and their drivers, working closely with partners, such as the National Income Housing Coalition, to transform structures, policies, narratives, and inform action to achieve a more inclusive and equitable society. One of our major areas of research focuses on racial wealth disparities. As widely known, the racial wealth gap is much, much larger than the racial income. On average, for every $1, the typical white household owns, a household of color owns 5 to 10%. It's a huge gap, much, much larger than income. And this has actually been exacerbated by the Great Recession and housing, and I know you're going to talk about that, is one of the drivers in that as well. However, we identified housing as one of the major drivers of the racial wealth gap, and that shouldn't come as a surprise, as we know that multiple impacts of housing in neighborhoods on lifetime trajectories. We're very thrilled about this new partnership. We've been interested in documenting the impact of the mortgage interest deduction on racial wealth disparities for a very, very long time. However, there are no data linking tax expenses with race. Oops, not there yet, but okay. Well, while I'm talking, this is the graph we're going to talk about in a minute. So our work is really framed by one guiding research question. How much of this very, very large tax benefit, which is about more than 70 billion, goes to white, Black, Latino, and Asian households? And the overall answer, you wouldn't be surprised to hear, the lion's share goes to white, mostly affluent households. On the back of communities of colors who benefit to a much, much lesser degree, from this housing subsidy through the tax code. So what did we do? So there were no data available to link, taxes paid with race and ethnicity. So we went back to a national survey conducted by the census, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, and used that along with estimates that were provided by the Joint Committee on Taxation in their 2015 report. So now to this slide. So first, we ask the question, who qualifies for the mortgage interest deduction? Clearly, there will be two things there, two requirements to qualify. You have to be a homeowner and you have to carry a mortgage. And here we're showing housing tenure data by race and ethnicity. We know homeownership rates have been consistently higher for white households. Currently, about 70% of white households owns compared to just 40 of black households. This gap has been increasing. Clearly, the MID did not do anything to help close this gap. And then who holds a mortgage among homeowners? And we see here on this chart behind me that about 40% of all white households own a home with mortgages, and thus are MID eligible. These percentages are lower for communities of color, and of course, the percent of them owning a home is lower. Just 25% of black households and 30% of Latino households carry mortgages on their home, and about a third of Asian households own their home with mortgages. However, if you just look at just homeowners, and I'm not showing these numbers here, you see that proportionately more households of color carry mortgages than white households. Among white homeowners, about 55% carry a mortgage compared to close to 2/3 among households of color. And we know from our research, other research we're not showing here or meeting today, is that white households have a much easier way to get into the housing market. They're much more likely to get some transfers from their families, financial transfers to help them buy their own home, and they are younger when they start owning their first home on average by 8 years. So, they have really longer time in the markets, and they also have a better chance to pay off their mortgages. Next slide. I hope this is going to work. Okay, so what we're showing here is just, the proportion of different race groups in the US and in general. And when we then compare to those who actually receive an estimated MID subsidy, we see a very different picture. You can do the next. So inner circle coming, yeah. So you see, the equitable share is the outer circle, and the inner circle is the current share who actually receive. So, for example, blacks make up about 13% of the US population, only 6%. Haven't received an MID benefit. Latinos, they also make up about 13%, 7%. And on the other hand, for whites, they make up about 67%, and they receive the lion's share, they receive about 78% of the MID. So now the next step we did, and I don't have one more slide, so I'm done with my slides. So we're translating these disproportionate benefits into monetary terms. And when we do that, we see that about close to $5 billion more is taken away, so to speak, from the black community and given to white communities. The number is about $4.1 billion for Latinos. So in essence, there's about $9 billion that this benefit takes away from communities of colors and redistributes to white households. I will end here, underscoring that this country's racial histories and policies, such as redlining and GI Bill, benefited mostly white households, which got us to the place where we are now. And MID, all it does, if anything, is keep us there. So thank you.
Michele.
Thank you. I'm also delighted to be here to participate in a conversation that helps us sort of examine, and this is the way that I'll frame my comments this morning, our biases. I'd like to also make sure that we remember our history and also keep in mind the importance of transparency when we're deciding who benefits from the mortgage interest deduction. First, our biases. The United States has always been biased in favor of people who buy single-family occupied housing. We see these biases clearly on display when we look at the differences between, and more importantly, the perceptions of the recipients of Section 8 housing subsidies and the recipients of what I am calling Section 163 housing subsidies. If you say the phrase Section 8, in the minds of most Americans, there's a perception of who is receiving that subsidy. The person is lower income, a person of color, likely black, on welfare, receiving a housing handout because they refuse to work. They haven't earned it, they don't deserve it. Only one of those perceptions is true. The recipients of a Section 8 housing voucher are indeed poor. The more than 5 million people who live in approximately 2 million households who receive these subsidies earn roughly 80% less than the average income in their area, or generally speaking, $47,000 for a family of 3 in this country. The perception that they are black is inaccurate. Government data consistently show that 50% at least of whites actually receive some form of federal public housing assistance. And the perception that they are lazy and refuse to work is also not true. Once you net out the disabled and the elderly, 70% of the people who receive a Section 8 housing subsidy either have recently worked or are currently working. So let's contrast those quite negative biases with the very positive biases we have in favor of people that receive a Section 163 housing subsidy. And of course, I'm picking that number because that's the tax code provision that allows you to deduct mortgage interest. When most people have objected for decades to any attempt to repeal or to modify the mortgage interest deductions because the perception that they have of the person that receives a Section 163 subsidy is that they're middle class, that they would not buy a home, wouldn't be able to buy a home without the subsidy, and that they're a thrifty, hard-working contributor to society. And only one of those perceptions is true. It is true that people that take the mortgage interest deduction and receive a Section 163 subsidy do work, or at least they earn income. And as we've heard already, they have to earn enough income for it to make sense for them to itemize their deductions rather than to take the standard deduction. As we've already heard, they are not middle class. The mortgage interest deduction disproportionately benefits upper income people. But one thing I'd sort of like us to keep in mind is that the mortgage interest deduction does not encourage people, upper income people, to buy homes. They're going to buy homes anyway. So one significant difference between the people that receive the Section 8 housing subsidy and those that receive the Section 163 housing subsidy is that one group likely would be homeless without the housing subsidy. The other group will not. So if we're thinking in terms of who is deserving and who needs a housing subsidy, it's the people that receive the Section 8 housing subsidy, not the people that receive the $70+ billion in the mortgage interest deduction. Until recently, no one really talked about race with respect to the people that receive the Section 163 subsidy. But as we've seen from the slides already, you need to have a certain amount of income in order to take the deduction, and more importantly, you have to have a home. Blacks and Latinos have lower homeownership rates, and they have lower median household income. So the Section 163 people that receive that subsidy are disproportionately white. Second, our history. I actually don't have to talk a lot about our history because Tatjana has already mentioned a lot of it. When we look at why we are where we are, and when we look at why there are very different perceptions about who receives a Section 8 housing subsidy and who receives a Section 163 subsidy, it's about our history. Quick walk through history, we can't avoid redlining and the fact that that allowed white middle class or white lower income and working class Americans after World War II to buy a home cheaply with an FHA insured loan in ways that blacks could not. When we look at the way that highways were created, they destroyed black communities to make it easy for white suburbanites to live in the suburbs, blacks could not, and then go in the cities to work. So as we rebalance and reprioritize U.S. tax policies, we can't forget our history. And the last comment I'll make is the need for transparency. We need to be honest about our biases and we need to remember our history. So if we think it's a good idea, good as a matter of public policy, to subsidize the housing costs for upper income Americans, we need to say it. We need to say it's okay even though we have poor and middle class Americans that can't find homes. If we think it's a good idea to continue to exacerbate the racial wealth gap, we need to say it. We need to be honest in what we're doing. If we don't think that's good, then what we need to do is to find a way to make housing more affordable for all Americans.
Well, as the cleanup hitter on this panel, I just want to be a pediatrician at Boston Medical Center and a principal investigator at Children's Health Watch. Children's Health Watch, if you're not familiar, is a national research policy network. Our mission is actually to improve the health and development of families and children by alleviating common hardships such as hunger, unstable housing, problems keeping the heat or the lights on, and addressing the policies that either create those conditions or alleviate them. So one may ask, why is a doctor here today to talk about housing tax policy, right? And what I'll say is, I'm here because my patients need me to be here. This tax policy is going to literally hurt millions of families if it goes through. And I think that in many ways, why wouldn't I be here to decry it and suggest that there's a better prescription out there for what we can do to actually improve the health and development of children and families. I think really the evidence is clear. Where you live is one of the strongest predictors of your health now and in the future. We know that if you're homeless or moving frequently, you are more likely to have developmental delays as a child, not do as well in school. That is the economic ladder up. We know that if you have a kid with asthma and they're living in a substandard housing home, that is going to make them more likely to have asthma attacks, go to the ED, be hospitalized, fall further behind in school. We know that if you are behind on your rent or cost burden, you're commonly making choices between rent, heat, food, or other necessities like healthcare. And so it's why I sometimes will refer to this stable, decent, affordable home is like a vaccine. It keeps you healthy now and in the future. And so really the urgency is now. Under the current policy, we have 20 million households that are forced to choose between rent or heat or mortgage or medication or food. And we estimate 10 million families are actually having preventable health issues related to unstable homes. And yet only 1 in 4 families are getting the help they need, the help to get a stable home to be healthy. Through our Children's Health Watch research, we have started to try and estimate, what if everything had a stable home? What are the avoidable costs? And we estimate it's $111 billion over 10 years. Those are related to costs related to basic health care, special education costs, mental health services. It's a very conservative number. We're just based on our interviews with mothers and families. We're not estimating father costs, grandparents costs, chronic disease costs. I think that this number could be doubled if we added those in. And so when we talk about kind of government and tax policy, it shouldn't pick winners and losers. And yet we know that that current policy is doing that. And the current proposal will make that worse. We know that the current policy disproportionately benefits people who need the help least and doesn't do enough to help the people who need it most. We can do better. There are solutions for this. We can shift the smart reforms in the mortgage interest tax deduction to fund things like the Affordable Trust Fund and a renter's tax credit. The money from reforming the mortgage interest tax reform cannot go to corporations. It has to go to families. America's kids and families are counting on you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of our really powerful speakers today. We have plenty of time for discussion and questions, so please be thinking about what you might want to ask our panel of experts. And first I'm going to ask Carol Lehman from Representative Keith Ellison's office, who, as I said earlier, has been a longtime champion on affordable housing and on working to rebalance federal housing policy. He's introduced legislation in the past 3, including this one in 3 Congresses, to do just that. So Carol, do you want to say a few words on behalf of Representative Keith Ellison?
Sure, thanks, Diane. Thanks, everybody. What an amazing panel and incredible, really great turnout. On behalf of Congressman Ellison, been working on this issue actually 4 Congresses. 5.5 years ago, introduced, the current bill is H.R. 948, the Common Sense Housing Investment Act. And H.R. 948 does this, what you're suggesting, the 15%, the cap, and then puts money into affordable rental housing solutions targeted to extremely low-income people. We have amazing, you all have done a fantastic job of laying out the details, so if you're a congressional staffer, I can provide you this information, as I'm sure you will, but also zip code data by your congressional district, so you know the impact, and you can see for yourself that the mortgage interest deduction changes would be actually better for the people that you represent than the current system that's so regressive. And the bill's had many co-sponsors, and my boss has introduced this bill. 5 years ago, we were threatened, if you do this, you will touch the third rail. Your boss will never get reelected, and that has not been the case at all. People really see in our district how important it is to have it, and we're Minneapolis, so we're the most racial, that was excellent, excellent. That's the most racially disparate of the metro areas and the most affordable. And people really can see that he's trying to address the affordable rental housing crisis. So thank you all. And I guess my question would be, because we want to put the money into affordable rental housing, and we know we've got an incredibly strong network of nonprofits who've developed and have housing, if you could just say a little bit more about that network of affordable housing providers.
Sure. I'll take that one. So one of the solutions that I talked about earlier for taking that $241 billion and reinvesting it into rental housing solutions for the lowest income people, like the National Housing Trust Fund program. So that's our newest federal program that was designed precisely to meet this need, to fill the gap of affordable homes for the lowest income renters. It was a 17-year campaign that the National Income Housing Coalition led to get that program created, enacted, and then funded together with, tremendous congressional champions. The program first received its first funding 2 years ago, about $176 million nationally. This year it's $220 million nationally. That program is essentially a block grant that goes to states who then put out RFPs to mostly nonprofit developers to use those funds to build, to rehabilitate, to preserve rental housing for the lowest income people. So it's a really important new resource that is being put to work today in every state to build homes for the lowest income people, but it's a very small amount compared to the need that we talked about earlier. So one of the things that we most need to do is to look for ways to significantly expand that program, and one of the best ways to do that is to reinvest savings from the mortgage interest deduction reform into the National Housing Trust Fund program. Are there other questions? Yes.
Good morning, Antoine Thompson, National Association of Real Estate Brokers. We sent you the new report. I brought one for all the panelists on the state of housing in Black America. I do understand your concern about the disparity in the mortgage interest deduction. I'm just puzzled, why wouldn't you look at reforming the interest deduction so that more African American, low to moderate income homeowners could be covered, as opposed to really exacerbating the problem of the rental society that's going on in the Black community, where, over the downturn, a lot of the single-family homes that were lost to Black people are now being converted to renters. And I think continue to push that message of Black people should be renters versus owners. I think this is bad public policy.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate that. That's not at all what we're doing, and we actually are working towards what you're suggesting, which is a way to make homeownership more affordable for low and middle income homeowners, including people of color. I'll see if our panelists want to take that first, and then maybe I'll add something.
I think your point is excellent. The data I presented showed the racial disparities in home ownership, and I think when we think about how the middle class has created wealth in this country, it has been through a home. In fact, I've said that America First economic policy begins at home, and it begins with home ownership. So I do agree that the mortgage interest deduction should be renovated so that it is a broader based credit for people who need it. So on that, I think there is common agreement.
I guess the one thing I would add, and I'm probably the biggest naysayer on the panel, is that historically, we have to fix more than just the mortgage interest deduction in order to increase Black homeownership rates. Black homeownership rates have lagged white homeownership rates always. The best we typically get is about 25%. So during the housing bubble, the number of Black homeowners increased at a rate that was faster than the number of white homeowners, but the gap remained. Until we can deal with the other issues of systemic racism and the fact that Blacks have lower median household income, the fact that even during the housing boom, when Black homeownership rates increased, in many instances they increased because Blacks and Latinos were pushed into subprime toxic mortgages, which, what a surprise, when the bubble burst, we lost our homes first. So I agree that housing has always been a way to increase middle class wealth, but it has typically worked better for white members of the middle class than Black members of the middle class because of this other issue of sort of systemic racism that's going on the side.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just like to add another statistics. So we have done work looking at the impact of home ownership on the racial wealth gap, and we just assume that there will be similar ownership rates. You know, the big racial wealth gap I outlined earlier would be reduced by 20%. But in order to get there, you know, everything that Meschede just mentioned is in place, and the question is the home mortgage interest deduction actually the best way of getting there? And a lot of the evidence says it's not. There are other ways.
Right, and just to add on to that, I think research has shown again and again, and very compellingly, that the mortgage interest deduction, as it is today, does not incentivize homeownership for people who wouldn't otherwise be homeowners anyway. It incentivizes debt. It incentivizes people who are currently homeowners to take on a bigger mortgage and take on more debt and increase the amount of their deduction. But the changes that we proposed, excuse me, to the mortgage interest deduction would actually make that benefit of having a mortgage available to more low and middle income homeowners, who many of whom don't get any benefit today from having a mortgage because they don't earn enough to itemize their taxes and benefit from a deduction. So shifting from a deduction to a credit, which is one of our proposals, would actually create a tax break for 25 million low and middle income homeowners. 10 million of those are low income homeowners, many of them people of color, who currently don't get any tax break from having a mortgage, where higher income white homeowners do. So it's certainly not about trying to dismiss the need for incentives for low and middle income homeowners of color to become homeowners. It's actually a way to do that, and at the same time to save tens of billions of dollars that we're spending today to subsidize the homes of some of the wealthiest people in the country and the world, right? And use those resources better to target them to low-income renters who are clearly the ones with the greatest needs for federal housing subsidies to be stably housed. Other questions? Yes, please.
Is there any data that shows for like high-cost states like New York or the tri-state area of New Jersey, Connecticut, or Illinois, what the impact would be of getting rid of the mortgage deduction and how it would actually have a negative effect on the rental market in the sense of people who, you know, are where it's a higher cost of living and they're making less money, but in a house we can get rid of the interest deduction, and now they can't afford to stay in their house because their taxes are going to go up. So they decide to sell their house and move into rental, and their rental market is already, there's already not enough rental housing. Is there any data that would show that that would happen in areas like New York City or Long Island or Chicago, those types of areas?
Well, a couple things I'd say on that. One is that, as you know, the changes to the mortgage interest deduction that we're proposing, especially on lowering the cap from $1 million down to $500,000, would have the greatest impact in New York and California primarily, because there are higher home ownership costs there. The mortgage interest deduction there's also a whole body of research that has shown that the mortgage interest deduction itself drives up the costs of homes. So in places where the homeownership market has become the costs have skyrocketed, that's in part due to the fact that we have the mortgage interest deduction in the way that we do. So reforming the mortgage interest deduction could actually level out some of the prices of homes in some of those higher cost markets. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're not proposing, and I don't believe it's on the table at all, to entirely eliminate the mortgage interest deduction. As you said, the changes that we proposed and others are proposing is to reform it. And in those higher cost markets, those homeowners who own a home of, say, $600,000 or have a mortgage of $600,000, $700,000, they're still deducting, under our proposal, they would still deduct the interest up to $500,000. So they're still getting a pretty significant housing subsidy, even if that cap is lowered, while other low-income renters are receiving no subsidy at all. So there's no suggestion from our proposals to eliminate the mortgage interest deduction altogether. Did you want to say something on that, Carol?
Nobody else
Go ahead.
did. So I'm, as a staffer who's worked on this for 5.5 years, that happens to me all the time. When you talk about we're making a small change to the mortgage interest deduction, everybody hears elimination. Everybody hears it. We're like, that's not what we're talking about, is eliminating mortgage interest deduction. We're talking about targeting it. And so the second question, I'm also the staffer who's worked on this for 5.5 years, and I'll have 30 realtors come in and want to debate this issue. And the thing that I've gotten to really try to hit home, and that they're really starting to understand this, is they're realtors and their job is they want to sell homes, right? And 7 out of 10 new homeowners right now are households of color. Those are the people buying homes right now. Next decade, that's this decade, next decade it's 9 out of 10. And if those folks do not have affordable rental housing now, they're not going to have a down payment. They're not going to have a great credit score that they can actually buy the homes that the realtors want to sell. And so for white homeowners who are the ones benefiting from this right now, we're going to be old and we're going to sell and we're going to want to go somewhere and move into living in some community, and we need to make sure that there's people who want to buy our homes. And so getting more money into the rental side and just tweaking, and we're really just tweaking by a few $1,000s at the upper income side, I think is going to be so much better for the housing market than the broken system.
Other questions? Yes.
So what data, you're talking about large metropolitan areas. What data do y'all have on the rural housing market and how this change might affect that position?
Well, the rural housing market, I mean, as we looked at earlier, one, the rental needs and the needs for the lowest income renters are as severe in rental communities as they are in urban communities. So the issue of a lack of affordable homes for the lowest income renters exists everywhere in the country. It's an urban problem, it's a suburban problem, and it's a rural problem as well. So there's the need for investing in the solutions to make housing more affordable in those areas as much as there is in the urban areas. Sarah, did you want to add something on on rural housing?
Yeah, I'll just point out that very fewer people, homeowners in rural areas, benefit from the mortgage interest deduction because home values are lower there, incomes are lower there too, so they're less likely to itemize than they do, and that's why you in the chart that Diane showed earlier about the percentage of mortgages that are above $500,000, you'll see it's very low, less than 2%, less than 1% in states that have a very high rural population. So converting into a credit will be able to reach those homeowners as well, who currently don't receive much benefit at all.
Other questions? So a couple things I would just say to keep in mind and take back to your offices and take back to your bosses about these issues. One is that clearly there is a significant disparity and inequities in the way that we fund federal housing today, and the bulk of our federal spending on housing is skewed towards higher income homeowners when the needs are most clearly among the lowest income renters. So there's action that your bosses can take immediately to help fix this. I know that all of you are hearing from constituents in your communities about the affordable rental housing crisis and how severe it's becoming and how few homes are available and affordable for the lowest income people. So comprehensive tax reform offers a tremendous opportunity to correct this issue and to invest in rental housing solutions. One way to do this is to, if your boss is a member of the House of Representatives, to co-sponsor Keith Ellison's bill, H.R. 948, the Common Sense Housing Investment Act. As Carol talked about and we talked about before, it essentially encapsulates everything we talked about today and puts it into legislative language to make it possible to reform the mortgage interest deduction and invest in rental housing solutions. The other piece is in comprehensive tax reform as it moves forward in the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee. As I started off by saying, the Big Six tax plan does reform the mortgage interest deduction, but it does it indirectly. And in doing it indirectly, it takes the savings from some pretty significant changes to the mortgage interest deduction, and it uses it to pay for lowered corporate tax rates rather than reinvesting it into housing where the greatest need is. So even if your boss is not quite ready to get into the debate over whether and how the mortgage interest deduction should be reformed, they have a really important role to play to say that when the mortgage interest deduction is reformed, we have to ensure that those housing dollars stay in housing programs and that they're reinvested into housing solutions for the lowest income renters. And then to go further and push for actually keeping that savings in programs, investing it in the National Housing Trust Fund, investing it into newer ideas like renters' tax credits that can be also paid for through the tax code and within the jurisdiction of the tax writing committees. So please go back to your offices, ask us more questions if you have them or need any more information to make the case, but to ask members of Congress to ensure that these housing dollars stay within housing programs and are targeted towards those with the greatest needs. So thanks again very much for participating and attending today. Thanks for your attention. Please join me in thanking this tremendous panel.